Gunfire echoes in Thomas Croft's nightmares, but nothing haunts him like the whimper he never heard. Told his loyal canine partner perished in an Afghan valley, this former Navy SEAL walked away from everything. 5 years later, a crippled stray on a desolate Texas highway forces his truck and his reality to a screeching halt. Rain battered the windshield of the 18-wheeler as Thomas Croft pushed his massive rig through the desolate, ink-black stretch of Interstate 10. The rhythmic thud of the wipers was the only sound inside the cabin, keeping time with the dull, persistent ache in his chest. At 38, Thomas looked a decade older. Deep lines framed his piercing blue eyes, and silver threaded through his thick, untrimmed beard. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, his gaze fixed on the hypnotic yellow lines swallowed by his headlights. He was a man running from ghosts, preferring the solitary hum of a diesel engine to the deafening silence of a quiet room. 5 years had passed since the night that shattered his world, yet in Thomas's mind, the dust of the Helmand province had never truly settled. Before the truck, before the endless miles of asphalt and the cheap diner coffee, Thomas had been a highly decorated operator in Navy SEAL Team 6. He was a man forged in grueling training and baptized in covert operations across the globe. But he never worked alone. His shadow, his protector, and his best friend was an 85-pound purebred German shepherd named Odin. Odin was not just a military working dog. He was an extension of Thomas's own soul. Raised together from the moment Odin was a 6-month-old pup, the two communicated in micro-expressions and silent hand signals. Odin's intelligence was terrifyingly sharp. The German shepherd possessed a golden plush coat, offset by a striking melanistic mask that made him look like a wolf stalking the desert night. Together, they had survived 3 tours. Odin had sniffed out dozens of improvised explosive devices, taken down fleeing combatants, and, on more than one occasion, served as Thomas's emotional anchor when the horrors of war threatened to drown him. The nightmare that ended it all played on a continuous loop in Thomas's memories, triggered by the flashing red lights of distant radio towers or the sudden backfire of a passing vehicle. It was supposed to be a standard high-value target extraction in a remote compound near the Pakistani border. Intelligence had been sparse, but the command was confident. They moved in under the cover of a moonless night, the silence heavy and suffocating. Odin had been on point, his nose to the ground, moving with a fluid, predatory grace. Suddenly, the German shepherd had stopped dead. He hadn't sat down the universal signal for explosives, but instead the fur along his spine bristled, and he let out a low, vibrating growl. It was a warning of an ambush. Thomas had raised his fist to halt the squad, but it was too late. The night erupted into a blinding hellscape. A hidden tripwire detonated a massive secondary charge buried beneath the compound walls. The concussive wave picked Thomas up and threw him violently against a reinforced steel door. The last thing he saw through the chaotic haze of smoke, fire, and falling debris was Odin charging forward into the dust cloud, teeth bared, intercepting an insurgent who had raised an RPG toward the pinned squad. Then everything went black. Thomas woke up 3 weeks later in a sterile, painfully bright room at the Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. His body was broken, a fractured pelvis, 3 broken ribs, and a severe traumatic brain injury. But the physical pain paled in comparison to the agony of the news delivered by his commanding officer, Captain Gregory Hayes. Hayes had sat beside the hospital bed, his face pale and grim, turning his cover over and over in his hands. "We lost him, Tommy," Hayes had said, his voice cracking. The structure collapsed after the secondary blast. The fire. It was too intense. We couldn't recover the remains. Odin is gone. He saved your life. He saved all of you. The words had hollowed Thomas out, leaving a gaping void that nothing could fill. A military working dog is considered a fellow soldier, but to a canine handler, the loss is identical to losing a child. Thomas's recovery was slow and entirely devoid of hope. He received a Purple Heart and an honorable medical discharge, but he left the military a fractured man, Upon returning to civilian life in San Diego, his trauma manifested as explosive anger and crippling isolation. His fiancée, Sarah, tried desperately to reach him, to pull him out of the dark trenches of his survivor's guilt, but Thomas pushed her away, unable to bear the look of pity in her eyes. He couldn't sleep. Whenever he closed his eyes, he heard the phantom click of Odin's paws on the floorboards or felt a phantom wet nose against his hand. He eventually packed a single duffel bag, left his engagement ring on the kitchen counter, and bought a commercial trucking license. For 5 years, Thomas had lived in the cab of his Peterbilt. He took the longest, most punishing routes across the country, punishing himself for walking away from that Afghan valley, while his partner remained buried in the rubble. He had convinced himself that the Thomas Croft who laughed, loved, and fought with honor had died in that explosion. Only the shell remained, steering 18 wheels through the dark. The blinding rain of the previous night had given way to the suffocating, oppressive heat of a West Texas afternoon. Thomas was driving a load of heavy machinery down Route 277, a lonely, sun-baked stretch of highway flanked by nothing but scrub brush, barbed wire fences, and the occasional rusted oil derrick. The air above the asphalt rippled and warped with heat mirages, playing tricks on the eyes. Thomas adjusted his aviator sunglasses and took a sip of lukewarm water. The radio crackled with static, picking up faint fragments of a local country station before fading back into white noise. He was 50 miles from the nearest town, mesmerized by the monotony of the drive, when he saw it. About a quarter of a mile ahead, a dark shape materialized through the shimmering heat waves. At first, Thomas thought it was a blown-out truck tire, a road gator, or the carcass of a coyote. But as the 18-wheeler closed the distance at 65 miles per hour, the shape shifted. It staggered. It was a dog. Thomas immediately downshifted, the heavy engine roaring in protest as he applied the air brakes. The massive rig shuddered, tires screaming against the burning asphalt, sending up a cloud of white smoke. The truck violently decelerated, the cab violently rocking, before finally coming to a hissing halt mere yards away from the animal. Thomas cursed under his breath, his heart pounding in his throat. He threw the truck into park, grabbed his heavy leather gloves and a bottle of water, and pushed the heavy metal door open. The Texas heat hit him like a physical blow as he climbed down from the cab. "Hey, get out of the road," Thomas yelled, his voice raspy from disuse. The dog didn't move. It just stood there, directly in the center of the lane, staring at the towering grille of the Peterbilt. As Thomas cautiously approached, his anger melted into profound pity. The animal was in horrific condition. It was a German shepherd, though barely recognizable as one. Its once proud coat was matted with dried mud, tar, and what looked like old blood. The dog was severely emaciated, its ribs jutting out sharply against its flanks. Its left hind leg was pulled up awkwardly, bearing no weight, and a jagged raised scar slashed across its snout, missing its left eye entirely. "Jesus, buddy," Thomas muttered softly, the hardened trucker facade slipping away. He uncapped the water bottle and poured a little into his cup palm. "You're a long way from nowhere. Come here. Let's get you off the blacktop before you get flattened." The dog's remaining golden eye locked onto Thomas. It didn't cower. It didn't bolt. Instead, it let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a growl of aggression, but a strange, vibrato whine. Thomas froze. A chill, entirely incongruous with the 100-degree heat, washed over his entire body. His breath hitched in his chest. No, it's not possible. The heat is getting to you. You're hallucinating. Thomas forced himself to take another step forward. The dog limped toward him, its head lowered. As the animal stepped into the shadow of the truck, the harsh sunlight stopped, obscuring its features. Thomas dropped to his knees on the burning pavement, ignoring the searing pain as his jeans offered little protection against the hot asphalt. The dog possessed a striking melanistic mask, obscured by filth but unmistakably patterned. The right ear stood perfectly erect, but the left ear was missing its top third, a precise notch. Thomas's mind violently rejected what his eyes were seeing. 5 years ago, during a breach training exercise in Coronado, a flashbang had gone off too close to Odin, permanently scarring and tearing the tip of his left ear. It was a distinctive, jagged notch. "Odin?" Thomas whispered, the name tasting like ash and broken glass on his tongue. The dog stopped 2 feet away. It looked at the broken man kneeling on the highway. Slowly, deliberately, the German shepherd pushed its battered head forward and pressed its skull hard against the center of Thomas's chest. Thomas gasped, tears instantly springing to his eyes and spilling over his weathered cheeks. It was a specific, highly trained maneuver. Deep pressure therapy. When Thomas used to wake up screaming in the barracks, Odin would execute this exact move, pressing his heavy head against Thomas's sternum to regulate his handler's breathing and heart rate. It wasn't something a stray dog did. It wasn't a coincidence. Trembling uncontrollably, Thomas reached out. His calloused fingers brushed over the coarse, filthy fur of the dog's neck. He felt the familiar ridge of muscle, the scar on the snout, and then he gently felt behind the dog's right ear. In military K9 units, a specialized microscopic tattoo is often inked onto the inner flap of the ear or the inner thigh for identification. Thomas gently flipped the dog's intact right ear back. He wiped away a thick layer of grime with his thumb, his own spit, and a desperate, frantic energy. There, faded and blurred by time, but undeniably present, was a string of alphanumeric characters. M, K, 9, 47, Odin's service number. The water bottle slipped from Thomas's grasp, clattering onto the highway. He wrapped his massive arms around the filthy, ruined animal, burying his face in the foul-smelling fur, and sobbed. A grown man, a hardened Tier 1 operator, weeping on the side of a deserted highway. Odin let out a long, exhausted sigh and leaned his entire body weight against his handler, his tail giving a weak, rhythmic thump against the asphalt. But as the initial shock of the impossible reunion washed over him, a dark, terrifying realization began to form in the back of Thomas's mind. Captain Hayes had told him Odin was dead. Command had classified the dog as killed in action. There had been a memorial service. Thomas had spent 5 years in a self-imposed purgatory, drowning in grief over a death that had apparently never happened. How did a military working dog, supposedly blown to pieces in Afghanistan, end up crippled and starving on a highway in West Texas half a decade later? Thomas pulled back, looking into Odin's remaining eye. The dog was exhausted, running on the last fumes of adrenaline and loyalty. Someone had lied. Someone had left his partner behind, or worse, brought him back and abandoned him to a life of unimaginable cruelty. The trucker who had pulled over to save a stray was gone. The ghost of Kandahar had vanished. As Thomas lifted the 90-pound shepherd into the cab of his truck, the Navy SEAL was reborn, and God help whoever had put his dog through hell. The cab of the Peterbilt transformed into a makeshift triage center as Thomas pushed the massive rig well past the speed limit, the diesel engine screaming as he barreled toward Midland, Texas. Odin lay on the passenger seat, his head resting heavily on Thomas's thigh. The dog was drifting in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and labored. Thomas kept one hand on the steering wheel and the other gently stroking the shepherd's matted fur, whispering promises he fully intended to keep. He bypassed the local emergency clinics and headed straight for a private, rural veterinary practice run by Dr. Emily Carter. Emily was a former Army veterinarian who had patched up specialized working dogs in Fallujah. If anyone could save Odin and keep her mouth shut while doing it, it was her. Thomas carried the 90-pound dog into the clinic just as the sun began to dip below the Texas horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red. Emily took one look at Thomas's frantic, tear-streaked face and the ruined animal in his arms, and immediately cleared her surgical table. For 3 grueling hours, Thomas sat in the sterile hallway, his hands stained with Odin's dried blood, staring blankly at the linoleum tiles. When Emily finally emerged, her surgical scrubs were soiled, and her expression was a mixture of professional exhaustion and profound, simmering anger. He's stable, Tommy, Emily said softly, taking a seat beside him. Severe malnutrition, severe dehydration. The leg fracture is old, healed wrong, likely from blunt force trauma. He's missing his left eye from what looks like a knife slash, and he's covered in defensive bite marks. But his heart is strong. He's a fighter. She paused, her jaw tightening. Tommy. I scanned him for a chip. I found the military tattoo, but I also found a secondary. Civilian RFID chip implanted deep in his shoulder. It's the kind used by private security firms to track high-value assets. Thomas's head snapped up, his blue eyes cold and sharp. The fog of depression that had clouded his mind for 5 years instantly evaporated, replaced by the deadly, calculating focus of a Tier 1 operator. Give me the chip data, he demanded, his voice dangerously calm. Sitting in his truck in the clinic's parking lot, Thomas opened his encrypted satellite phone, a relic from his past he had never been able to throw away. He dialed a number he hadn't called in half a decade. It belonged to Jonathan Mitchell, a former naval intelligence officer currently working as an independent cybersecurity contractor in D.C. Mitchell owed Thomas his life after a botched raid in Yemen. It was a debt measured in blood. Mitchell. It's Croft, Thomas said when the line clicked open. There was a heavy silence on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. Jesus, Tommy. You dropped off the grid completely. Everyone thought you were dead. I was? I'm not anymore, Thomas replied flatly. I need you to run an RFID serial number. Civilian sector, likely a private military contractor. I also need you to pull the classified after-action report for Operation Sandstorm. The Helmand extraction. 5 years ago. Tommy, that file is heavily redacted. What are you looking for? I'm looking for the man who stole my dog, Thomas growled. Over the next 48 hours, while Odin slept under the heavy influence of painkillers and IV fluids, the horrific truth began to unravel on the encrypted screen of Thomas's laptop. Mitchell had bypassed 3 federal firewalls to get the raw, unredacted data from that night in Afghanistan. The secondary explosion hadn't buried Odin. The compound collapse had been localized, intentionally staged to look catastrophic. Drone footage from a secondary Overwatch camera footage, conveniently omitted from the official briefing, showed 2 heavily armed men in unmarked tactical gear, loading a sedated German Shepherd into a civilian transport vehicle, just minutes before the rescue choppers arrived. But the most damning piece of evidence came from the RFID chip Emily had extracted. Mitchell traced the serial number to a shell corporation registered in Delaware, which funneled money directly into Apex Vanguard Solutions, a massive, highly lucrative private security firm based out of Odessa, Texas. The firm specialized in providing elite security details for foreign billionaires and politicians, boasting a fleet of unmatched, combat-tested K9s. And the CEO and founder of Apex Vanguard Solutions? Former Captain Gregory Hayes. Thomas stared at the smiling corporate headshot of his former commanding officer on the screen. The betrayal was absolute, a dagger twisted directly into his spine. Hayes hadn't just lied, he had capitalized on Thomas's tragedy. Fully trained, combat-experienced Tier 1 dogs were worth hundreds of thousands of dollars on the black market. Hayes had used his position to declare Odin K.I., stolen the dog right out of the combat zone, and smuggled him back to the States to be used as a breeding stud and a brutally trained attack dog for private buyers. Odin had spent the last 5 years in a concrete kennel, beaten, abused, and forced to fight, all while Thomas punished himself on the open road. Odin hadn't been abandoned on that highway by accident. According to Mitchell's satellite sweep, Apex Vanguard's primary training facility was located just 30 miles from where Thomas had found the dog. Odin hadn't just survived, he had escaped. The shepherd had broken out of a fortified PMC compound and dragged his crippled body across the scorching Texas desert, driven by an impossible cellular memory until he found the one man he had sworn to protect. Thomas closed the laptop. The quiet hum of the truck's air conditioning felt deafening. He didn't feel sadness anymore. He felt a terrifying, icy resolve. He reached beneath the bunk of his sleeper cab, his hand wrapping around the cold steel of a heavy, locked Pelican case. He hadn't opened it in 5 years. As the latches popped with a definitive click, revealing the meticulously maintained tactical gear and firearms inside, Thomas made a silent vow. Captain Gregory Hayes had taken his partner, his career, and 5 years of his life. Now, Thomas was going to take everything from him. The Apex Vanguard Solutions facility sat on 200 acres of isolated Texas scrubland, fortified like a military black site. 12-foot-high fences, topped with razor wire, surrounded the perimeter, illuminated by high-intensity floodlights, and monitored by a sophisticated network of thermal cameras. It was designed to keep heavily armed intruders out, but it was entirely unprepared for a ghost who already knew all of their tactical blind spots. Thomas arrived at 2 in the morning, leaving his massive Peterbilt hidden in a dry riverbed 3 miles away. He moved through the brush with the silent, predatory grace that had once made him a legend in the SEAL teams. Clad in dark tactical gear, his face painted with camouflage grease, he was no longer a broken truck driver. He was the consequence of Gregory Hayes's greed. Using Mitchell's real-time satellite overwatch fed through an earpiece, Thomas bypassed the outer perimeter sensors with terrifying ease. He didn't want a loud, chaotic firefight. He wanted surgical, devastating exposure. Slipping over the fence in a blind spot between camera pans, Thomas moved like a shadow toward the primary kennel, building a long, windowless concrete structure, echoing with the muffled, distressed barks of dozens of captive dogs. He neutralized the 2 perimeter guards using non-lethal close-quarters submission holds, zip-tying them to the chain-link fence and stripping them of their radios. Thomas picked the heavy biometric lock on the kennel door using an electronic bypass module Mitchell had overnighted to him. As the heavy steel door swung open, the stench of bleach, fear, and animal waste hit him like a physical blow. Row upon row of heavy steel cages lined the facility. Inside were Malinois, German Shepherds, and Dutch Shepherds, many bearing the unmistakable scars of harsh, abusive training methods. These weren't security dogs. They were prisoners of war. Thomas's heart ached, but he forced his emotions down, moving systematically down the aisle, placing small, localized breaching charges on the primary power conduits and the backup generators. Through the earpiece, Mitchell's voice crackled. "Tommy, you have company. SUV pulling up to the main administration building. It's Hayes. Looks like he got alerted to the perimeter breach." "Perfect," Thomas whispered. Thomas slipped out of the kennels and moved silently across the gravel courtyard toward the administration building. Inside the sprawling, luxurious office, Gregory Hayes was frantically screaming into a phone, a suppressed pistol resting on his mahogany desk. He looked older, heavier, his tailored suit a far cry from the desert camouflage he used to wear. The lights in the office suddenly flickered and died, plunging the compound into absolute darkness. The backup generators failed to engage. The frantic barking from the kennels abruptly ceased as Thomas remotely popped the magnetic locks on every single cage. Hayes froze, dropping the phone. "Who's there? Security! Get to my office now!" he yelled into his radio. There was only static. A heavy, suffocating silence descended on the room. Then, from the darkness of the corner, a voice spoke cold, deep, and familiar. "They aren't coming, Greg." Hayes spun around, bringing the pistol up, but a blinding light suddenly pinned him to the wall. Thomas stood in the doorway. A high-lumen tactical flashlight, mounted to a suppressed rifle, aimed squarely at Hayes's chest. "Tommy?" Hayes breathed, the color draining from his face as he lowered the weapon in sheer disbelief. "You're supposed to be in California. You're dead." "I was." For 5 years, Thomas stepped forward, the rifle perfectly steady. "While I was busy drinking myself to death over the guilt of leaving my partner behind, you were busy cashing checks." "How much was he worth, Greg? How much did you get for a Tier 1 dog who saved your life?" Hayes swallowed hard, his eyes darting toward the door. "Tommy, you don't understand the civilian market. The DoD was going to retire him anyway. I repurposed him. I built an empire. We provide the best security. You tortured him, Thomas roared, his voice shaking the glass in the window panes. He's missing an eye. He's crippled. You left him in a concrete box to be ripped apart by other dogs. You pathetic coward. Hayes raised his hands defensively. I didn't know the handlers were treating him like that, I swear. Tommy, listen, I have money. Millions. I can set you up for life. We can bury this. Thomas didn't shoot him. That would have been too easy. Instead, he pulled a small, flashing recording device from his tactical vest and tossed it onto Hayes's desk. I don't want your blood money, and I don't need to bury this. I just needed you to admit it. In the distance, the wail of dozens of police sirens began to pierce the quiet Texas night. Mitchell hadn't just been providing overwatch. He had forwarded the unredacted files, the drone footage, and the corporate money trail directly to the FBI and the Military Criminal Investigation Division. Federal agents were already swarming the front gate. It's over, Greg. You're going to Leavenworth, and you're going to spend the rest of your life in a concrete box. Let's see how you like it. Without another word, Thomas turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving Hayes trembling in the glow of the flashlight as the FBI breached the compound. 6 months later, the sun shone brightly on the coast of San Diego. Thomas sat on the porch of a small beachfront cabin, holding a mug of coffee. The heavy, dark bags under his eyes had faded. The truck was sold, the highway left behind. At his feet lay Odin. The German shepherd's coat was glossy and thick once more. He still walked with a limp, and his left eye was permanently gone. But the golden eye that remained was bright, alert, and full of peace. The screen door creaked open, and Sarah stepped out, carrying 2 plates of breakfast. Thomas had called her the day after the raid. It had taken months of hard conversations, tears, and therapy, but she had come back to him, realizing the man she loved hadn't died in Afghanistan, after all. As Thomas reached down to stroke Odin's scarred ear, the dog let out a soft, contented sigh, pressing his heavy head against his handler's knee. The ghosts of the valley were finally silent. They were home. Thomas and Odin's incredible journey proves that the bond between a soldier and his K9 can survive war, betrayal, and time itself. True loyalty never dies. It just finds its way home. If this story of heartbreak, justice, and redemption moved you, please hit that like button. Share it with your friends to honor our military working dogs, and subscribe to our channel for more unbelievable real-life survival stories. Drop a comment below to welcome Odin home.